Have you ever wondered what became of the V-2 rockets after the war ended? The rockets that exploded over cities, but the thousands of components, unfinished missiles, launch equipment, and captured machines left scattered across a defeated continent. In the silence that followed the fighting, Europe contained one of the largest collections of advanced military technology the world had ever seen, hidden in forests, abandoned on rail sidings, stored in tunnels, stacked inside ruined factories were weapons that only months earlier had represented the highest ambitions of German engineering. Now they sat without purpose, owner, or future. Yet, almost immediately, governments across Europe and beyond realized that the greatest struggle involving the V2 might begin only after the war was over. The end of hostilities left an unusual problem. Unlike conventional artillery or ordinary military vehicles, the V2 was a highly complex system requiring specialized fuel equipment, transport vehicles, guidance components, and trained personnel. Thousands of parts were dispersed across Germany and occupied territories. Production facilities had been damaged, supply chains had collapsed, and transportation networks were struggling to function. At the same time, the victorious powers faced enormous financial burdens. Cities required reconstruction, industries needed restarting, and millions of displaced people demanded food and shelter. Every railway wagon, warehouse, and truck occupied by captured military equipment represented resources that could be used elsewhere. The V2 inventory therefore became both a technological opportunity and a logistical burden. Across Central Europe, recovery teams moved through former launch areas and storage depots cataloging what remained. Some discoveries were expected, others appeared almost by accident. In forests, engineers found hidden stocks of rocket components near rail junctions. Long trains loaded with missile sections stood abandoned where crews had left them during the final weeks of the conflict. Underground facilities contained machinery still connected to power systems that no longer operated. Many locations held incomplete records, forcing investigators to reconstruct inventories piece by piece. The process revealed not a handful of rockets, but an industrial network whose scale surprised even experienced military planners. Particular attention focused on the enormous production complex associated with the V2 program. Underground manufacturing sites contained machinery worth millions in contemporary currency and represented years of technical development. Yet these facilities also reflected a difficult reality. Their purpose had vanished overnight. Maintaining them required labor, electricity, security, transportation that post-war authorities could scarcely afford. The question became whether to preserve, dismantle, or transfer these assets. Every option carried costs. Every delay consumed resources. The continent trying to rebuild basic infrastructure, even storing captured rockets, became an expensive commitment. The uncertainty surrounding ownership complicated matters further. As occupation zones solidified, equipment and components often lay in territories controlled by different allied powers. Teams raced to identify valuable equipment before administrative boundaries limited access. Warehouses that appeared insignificant from the outside sometimes contained guidance systems, engines, or technical documentation. Reports circulated describing hurried inspections, inventory lists written under pressure, and convoys moving captured material toward collection centers. Time mattered because everyone understood that the V2 represented more than scrap metal. It embodied knowledge that had required vast investment to create. In Western Germany, large quantities of rocket hardware were assembled for examination. Engineers confronted a mixture of complete missiles, damaged examples, and enormous numbers of spare parts. Many components had suffered from exposure, transport damage, or incomplete assembly. Fuel systems required inspection. Electrical equipment needed testing. Documentation often existed only in fragments. Yet enough material survived to suggest that functioning rockets could still be assembled. The possibility transformed the conversation. The issue was no longer simply disposal. Authorities now had to decide whether these weapons should be studied before being destroyed. The scale of the captured inventory was remarkable. Hundreds of transport vehicles connected to the V2 program survived in varying condition. Large stocks of engines, turbopumps, guidance instruments, and structural sections remained recoverable. Thousands of technical drawings and reports were collected from offices, factories, and research centers. Some records had been intentionally destroyed during the war's final phase, but many survived through oversight, haste, or sheer volume. The result was a technical archive unlike anything previously available to the victorious powers. Economic pressures nevertheless remained relentless. Cartridge depots required guards. Specialized equipment occupied valuable space. Rail transport consumed fuel and manpower that reconstruction efforts desperately needed. Governments faced difficult accounting decisions. Every month that captured material remained untouched generated additional expense. In some locations, officials favored immediate scrapping. Steel could be recycled, facilities could be repurposed. Land could be returned to civilian use. From a purely financial perspective, destroying the V2 infrastructure often appeared more practical than preserving it. Yet practical considerations collided with scientific interest. Examination teams discovered technologies that remained rare outside Germany. The rocket engine alone represented years of experimentation. Its propulsion system, manufacturing methods, and operational procedures attracted intense scrutiny. Technical specialists produced reports, disassembled components, and compared findings against existing domestic research. The process revealed both strengths and weaknesses. V2 had been costly, difficult to operate, and far from perfect. But it also demonstrated capabilities that few nations had previously achieved. As more information emerged, pressure grew to save selected examples from destruction. This created a strange landscape across post-war Europe. In one region, workers cut rocket sections apart for scrap. In another, nearly identical equipment was carefully packed into crates for transport. Some storage sites were emptied entirely, others became temporary laboratories where engineers documented every accessible component. Freight trains carrying captured material moved across damaged rail networks toward ports, research centers, and military depots. The same rocket could be viewed simultaneously as waste, evidence, or valuable technology depending on who examined it. The movement of V2 assets soon expanded beyond the rockets themselves. Launch equipment, fueling vehicles, testing instruments, and manufacturing machinery attracted equal attention. These supporting systems revealed how the missiles had been produced and operated. In many cases, understanding the surrounding infrastructure proved as important as examining the rockets. Investigators therefore collected complete groups of equipment whenever possible. Warehouses gradually filled with material awaiting classification. Clerks recorded serial numbers. Engineers prepared technical summaries. Administrators debated budgets. Behind every decision stood the same unresolved question: how much of this vast inheritance should be kept? Meanwhile, many captured rockets remained exactly where the war had left them, rested in remote depots awaiting transportation that never arrived on schedule. Others sat exposed to weather as authorities argued over priorities. Corrosion began affecting stored components. Wooden containers deteriorated. Documentation became separated from equipment. Each passing season reduced the value of material left unattended. What had once represented cutting-edge technology slowly became vulnerable to neglect. The race to recover and evaluate the V2 was therefore also a race against time. By the late stages of this initial post-war period, a clearer pattern was beginning to emerge. Governments had concluded that at least part of the captured inventory possessed significance beyond immediate military concerns. Collected rockets were being assembled, documents were being translated, and specialized equipment was being concentrated at designated locations. At the same time, vast quantities of hardware continued moving towards scrap yards, recycling facilities, and dismantling centers. The scattered V2 legacy was separating into two different futures. One path led toward preservation and study. The other led toward destruction and disappearance. Which rockets would follow each route, and how much of the original program would survive the economic realities of the post-war world remained uncertain as the fate of the scattered arsenal continued to unfold. Officials sorted inventories and engineers completed their first examinations. The scattered collection of captured V2 rockets began to shrink. The reduction did not happen through a single decision or coordinated international policy. Instead, it occurred through thousands of individual actions spread across multiple countries. A rocket engine judged unnecessary was cut apart. A transport vehicle lacking spare parts was sold for scrap. Storage depot scheduled for civilian redevelopment was cleared, piece by piece. One of the largest concentrations of advanced military technology in Europe started disappearing from the landscape. Yet before destruction could claim everything, selected rockets were removed from that process. Trains, loaded with missile sections, departed former German facilities carrying cargo unlike any other moving through post-war Europe. These shipments included complete rockets, partially assembled airframes, guidance components, engines, and thousands of technical documents. Some destinations were military proving grounds, others were research establishments where engineers sought to understand what had been captured before it vanished forever. The goal was no longer wartime use. The fighting had ended. What mattered now was knowledge. Practical challenge was immense. A V2 was not a machine that could simply be transported, unpacked, and operated. Components had to be matched with documentation. Missing parts needed identification. Damaged equipment required repair. Storage conditions had varied dramatically. Hardware had survived in protected facilities. Other pieces had spent months exposed to weather, neglect, and confusion. Teams spent countless hours cataloguing equipment before meaningful testing could even begin. Every successful reconstruction represented the recovery of a system that had nearly dissolved into scattered fragments. As these efforts continued, large portions of the original V2 inventory quietly disappeared from official records. Scrap merchants acquired surplus metal, industrial firms purchased machinery. Former military sites were cleared for economic redevelopment. In a Europe struggling to rebuild housing, transportation networks, factories and utilities, serving thousands of obsolete military assets rarely ranked as a priority. Practical needs consistently outweighed historical concerns. Few people at the time imagined that future generations would search for surviving examples of equipment that contemporary authorities often regarded as a burden. The economic logic was difficult to challenge. Maintaining captured rockets required money. Warehouses demanded upkeep. Security personnel required payment. Transportation consumed scarce fuel. Governments faced reconstruction costs measured in billions. Under those circumstances, dismantling surplus hardware frequently appeared to be the responsible choice. Tons of high-grade steel, copper, aluminum, and specialized materials could be recovered through scrapping programs. Process generated resources that rebuilding economies desperately needed. Each destroyed rocket therefore represented both a loss of historical material and a gain in immediate practical value. Even so, limited number survived because they continued to provide information. Engineers assembled captured V2s and conducted post-war launches to evaluate propulsion systems, guidance methods, manufacturing standards, and operational procedures. These launches were not attempts to revive the wartime program. Instead, they served as large-scale technical investigations. Every successful firing produced data. Every failure revealed weaknesses. Rockets themselves gradually became expendable research tools. One by one, they were consumed in testing, reducing the surviving inventory even further. The process created a paradox. The more valuable a captured rocket became scientifically, the more likely it was to be destroyed during examination or launch. Observation was rarely the objective. Understanding was. Engineers disassembled engines to inspect internal components. Guidance systems were taken apart for analysis, were modified to support experiments. Technical knowledge expanded while physical artifacts disappeared. By the time many authorities recognized the historical significance of what they possessed, much of the original material had already been consumed, recycled, or discarded. Physical locations associated with the V2 experienced a similar transformation. Former storage depots returned to civilian use. Launch preparation areas faded back into ordinary landscapes. Transportation routes once dedicated to missile operations resumed commercial activity. Underground facilities faced uncertain futures. Some were stripped of equipment and abandoned. Others found industrial purposes unrelated to their original role. The visible traces of the program diminished year after year. Visitors arriving decades later often discovered that entire sections of the wartime infrastructure had vanished beneath redevelopment, vegetation, or demolition. Documentation proved more durable than hardware. Technical reports, engineering drawings, production records, and administrative files survived in archives long after many rockets themselves had disappeared. These documents preserved details that scrap cutters could not destroy. They recorded dimensions, procedures, manufacturing techniques, and organizational structures. Historians would later rely heavily on these surviving records because the physical inventory had been reduced so dramatically. In many cases, a file cabinet outlasted the machine it described. By the middle of the post-war era, the captured V2 had largely ceased to exist as a scattered European arsenal. The enormous stockpiles that once occupied depots, rail yards, tunnels, and factories had been divided into distinct categories. A small number survived in research programs. Some remained as reference examples. Many had been consumed during testing. Most had entered recycling streams and disappeared into the industrial economy. Transformation was so extensive that observers looking back only a few years later would have struggled to comprehend the original scale of what had been captured. What remained was increasingly selective. Museums and preservation efforts eventually secured individual examples, but these represented only a tiny fraction of the original inventory. Thousands of components vanished without detailed records. Entire collections of support equipment were broken apart. Vehicles associated with rocket operations entered civilian service, were dismantled, or simply wore out through ordinary use. Attrition occurred gradually, making it less visible than dramatic destruction. Nevertheless, the result was the same. The vast technological system was steadily erased. Loss was not limited to hardware. Knowledge connected to day-to-day operations also faded, facilities closed, and personnel dispersed. Countless practical details disappeared from memory. Written reports preserved technical specifications, but they could not fully capture every routine procedure, improvisation, or logistical solution developed during years of operation. Historians later reconstructed much of this world through surviving records, photographs, and interviews, yet gaps remained. The physical disappearance of the rockets was accompanied by the gradual disappearance of context. Looking across Europe today, it is difficult to imagine the scale of the post-war problem. At the end of the conflict, captured V2 material existed in quantities large enough to fill warehouses, rail networks, industrial facilities, and military depots. Governments had to decide what to preserve, what to study, what to transport, and what to destroy. Decisions were shaped less by historical awareness than by immediate necessity. Reconstruction demanded resources. Storage cost money. Space was limited. Time was short. The fate of the rockets was determined not by a single dramatic moment, but by countless practical calculations repeated across a recovering continent. In the end, the scattered V2 rockets did not disappear all at once. They were dismantled, studied, launched, recycled, archived, forgotten, and occasionally preserved. Some survived because they offered useful information. Others survived by chance. Most did not survive at all. Their metal entered new products. Their facilities found new purposes. Their documents migrated into archives. What remained was a fragmented legacy spread across museums, research records, industrial sites, and historical memory. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the story is its quietness. Weapons that had once required enormous industrial effort, extensive transportation systems, specialized facilities, and vast financial investment did not end with a final act of destruction. They faded through paperwork, budgets, inventory lists, warehouse clearances, and scrap contracts. The post-war fate of the V2 was ultimately shaped by ordinary administrative decisions made in extraordinary circumstances. Today, when a surviving V2 stands behind museum barriers, it appears singular and rare. Yet that rarity is itself part of the aftermath. Exists because thousands of others no longer do. Across Europe, the captured rockets that once lay scattered after the war were gradually absorbed into the reconstruction of a continent. Their disappearance helped rebuild railways, factories, industries, and research programs. The arsenal that had seemed so vast in the silence following the conflict became smaller each year until only fragments remained, leaving behind a reminder that even the most advanced machines can become temporary visitors in history. If you enjoy detailed World War II aftermath stories that follow what happened after the headlines ended, consider supporting the channel. These overlooked chapters often reveal how history continued long after the fighting stopped, and how the fate of machines, places, and forgotten stockpiles sometimes tells as much about the post-war world as the war itself.